Hello, everyone. This is Clay, but with Tyler Tolbert, and this is The Pursuit of Ownership. This week, we have on a very special guest. His name is David Harris. He's going to be talking today about embezzlement, what that is, what it looks like, even giving some advice to some pre-owners and figuring out what's going on in practices when we're looking at financials. So, David, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us a little about yourself and your story.
Absolutely. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of a company called Prosperident, and Prosperident was founded 30 years ago. And it really does one thing. It works with dental practices in dealing with found or suspected embezzlement or helping a practice owner set up their systems to protect themselves. We have 23 people in total. We come from all corners of North America, and we're busy.
I guess that's a bad thing, huh? Well, good thing for you.
But I don't cause the embezzlement, Clay. I just keep
that's true. So if for our listeners that don't quite, they might have heard the term embezzlement. What does that look like? What kind of forms can that take specifically in a dental office?
The definition of embezzlement is that it's somebody who's in a position of trust stealing from the person who has entrusted them. So in a dental practice, most typically it's a staff member stealing from the practice. It could also be theoretically an associate dentist or even a co-owner in a group practice. It could also be somebody who's external, for example, a bookkeeper. So it's one of those people taking money. It typically happens on the revenue side. So most embezzlement that we see involves the theft of patient payments or insurance payments. And a smaller amount of it involves theft that increases practice expenses. So that might be, for example, tampering with payroll,
right,
or interfering with the bonus system that's in place in the practice, or even stealing dental supplies and selling them on eBay.
Okay. And is there anything about embezzlement that occurs in dental offices that is unique compared to other, similar small businesses?
That's a great question. In most other businesses, embezzlement happens predominantly on the expense side. So it's those things I mentioned, okay, like theft of inventory or payroll, or, if somebody has an expense account, if they're traveling for business, it's claiming improper expenses. That's the profile in most businesses. In dentistry, typically it involves stealing revenues. So again, that's payments coming in from patients or from insurance companies.
Are you seeing more embezzlers? Are they taking more of like cash, or are they more dealing with the insurance? Because I can, somebody who doesn't own a practice but is wanting to, the insurance, the whole industry, it can be very convoluted. So are you seeing more embezzlement with just straight up cash or actually with insurance payments?
When I started in this business, which was 1989, cash was what people stole. And in those days, the banking system functioned very differently than it does now. And stealing checks or credit card payments was much more difficult than it probably is today. So originally, when I started, cash was dominant. Certainly in the last 8 or 10 years, that has flipped over so that what we see now is typically theft of things other than cash. And let's be clear that cash is the first choice of every thief. There's nothing better to steal than cash, because you don't really have to take any active steps beyond the theft to convert it into something you can use. But the amount of money that most practices are taking in cash is small and shrinking over time. And frankly, I just don't think there's enough left for thieves to steal.
So that kind of goes to the insurance then. How much are we talking, I guess, on average? I know it can kind of vary, but how much are they just taking enough that a practice owner wouldn't notice, or is it over years and years and years? What has been your experience?
I'll give you some statistics and then talk a little bit about what they mean. The last time we looked in our case files, the average amount that a thief took before they got caught was about $109,000. And
Wow.
Wow.
wow,
Yeah, that's a lot.
it sure is. And on average, they went undetected for about 2 years. In other words, the prototype pattern, and there's lots of variability around this, but the prototype pattern is about $50,000 a year for 2 years. Now, having said that, we also see some thieves who have managed to drag this out for 8 or 10 years.
Yeah.
The other norm that I give people is typically a thief takes between 2 and 4% of a practice's collections. So in a practice that brings in $1.5 million a year, that translates to about $60,000 a year.
Sure. Yeah. So that's in terms of we're talking about in terms of how much money is typically being stolen. But what is the frequency with which this occurs? Do you know on like a percentage basis how many dental practices will typically be embezzled at a certain time?
I do, and there's some new information on that.
Okay.
The American Dental Association did a study in 2019, and the results got released a couple of months ago in February of 2020. And what they did was they asked about 17,000 practice owners, have you been embezzled? And from the group that responded, 53% said no, which really means I don't think so.
Right.
Right.
And the other 47% was stratified based on how many times they reported being embezzled. So 26% of the respondents said they'd been stolen from once, and I'll say this again, that I know of.
Right.
And the remainder, which is around 22%, had been stolen from somewhere between twice and more than 4 times. So I just gave a lot of numbers. Let me simplify it. Basically, if you start with 100 dentists in a room, about half of them have been stolen from, and half haven't as of yet. And of the half who have been stolen from, roughly half of them have been hit more than once.
Right. Right. And that's really a bare minimum because that's just restricted to what they're aware of, right?
Of course. I mean, there's non-detection. There's also probably some non-reporting. In other words, there are probably some people who have been stolen from and for whatever reason just aren't talking about it.
Okay. That's fair.
So, if you start with half have been stolen from and half haven't yet, and you assume that the survey caught most people at the midpoint of their career, then there's some probability that the remaining half will also be stolen from at some point.
Absolutely.
Right.
The real number is probably 90%. In other
Wow.
words, you guys in your careers have about a 90% chance that you'll be stolen from at some point. Now, maybe it's really small. Maybe it's somebody stealing pens from your practice, or maybe it's $1 million theft.
Okay.
Right. I guess there's a spectrum of, okay, I'm going to take some paper clips and some pens and maybe some notepads to 4% of the monthly revenue, right? I mean, does it start with pens and then progress to that? I mean, or is it more on the dentists? Are those half dentists that have been embezzled from? Are they just idiots and they don't look at stuff, or what's going on?
Well, I think when you start with 180,000 dentists in the U.S. who almost all are in the upper quartile of embezzlement, to think that half of them are idiots might be, among other things.
I was being a little harsh.
Right.
So, your words, Clay, not mine. No,
That might come back to bite me.
A couple of things. First of all, this is a very unequal battle. And that's something a lot of practicing dentists don't realize. You have conceivably 10 or 15 minutes a day to run your practice.
Right.
And if I'm working for you and planning to steal from you, I've really got all day to think about how to steal from you. Let's forget the knowledge gap, because typically I understand your practice management software a lot better than you do. But even beyond that, I have a lot more to invest in this than you have in stopping it. So it's a very unequal battle. And No, I don't think that we should view that the people who have been stolen from are fundamentally different from the other group. It's a bit of a statistical random walk. Let's think about why people steal.
Okay.
And they really steal for two reasons. And I often call them need and greed. So needy thieves are people who have something going on in their family finances that mean that there's more money going out each month than what's coming in.
Mm.
Maybe they're going through a divorce, maybe they have a gambling problem, but there's something that's kind of upset the monthly apple cart. And they're really stealing to balance the books. And at the time that we're recording this, which is right in the middle of the COVID crisis, probably there are more of these people than there normally would be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then we've got the greedy thieves. And these people are really stealing to address an ego deficit as opposed to a financial one. So they kind of feel like society's not rewarding them the way it should. And their way to correct that is I'll just take what I think somebody should be paying me.
Right.
And they're not necessarily really in tune with the economics of running a dental practice, but they just their picture of the doctor is that the doctor's taking home millions of dollars,
Mm-hmm.
getting paid a salary. And last year we had a really good year and we brought in a lot of new patients and the doctor gave me a 2% raise. They can come up with lots of justifications. So to answer your question about does it start small and grow, normally it does. Everybody sort of steals and keeps increasing the amount they take until they reach kind of the doctor's pain point. There are three ingredients, three preconditions, if you like, to be a thief. You need to have pressure, and that's the thing I talked about with need or greed. Those are both forms of pressure that get exerted on a thief. You need to have the opportunity to steal, and anybody working in a front desk in a dental practice has a fair amount of opportunity. And then you need rationalization. And rationalization is when you say, I know that in general stealing is wrong. However, in this case, it's okay because, and then you have some reason for breaking that rule that you've been taught since you were 3 years old. So the people who take pens are already rationalizing. They know those pens belong to the doctor. There's no doubt about that. But it's okay because she won't miss them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
David, could there be a situation where you could have the perfect storm, so to speak, or all those elements are there, but yet there's no evidence of embezzlement, or they're just stealing pins and not actual revenue or insurance checks, right? Like
those things are preconditions, not predictors.
Sure.
So there are all kinds of people who have those three things and still don't steal. However, there's nobody who steals without those three being present.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So it's not intended to be a predictive model, and absolutely there are some people who are there today with all three ingredients and they're still not stealing. In terms of do people start small and stay small, I'm sure that some do. Although once somebody proves that they're prepared to overcome that societal barrier against stealing, I'm just not sure that lines become anything other than arbitrary. In other words, I know very few people who say, well, it's okay to steal the doctor's pens or toilet paper from the restroom, but to take money would just be wrong.
Right. And I know we'll get into some of the ways that dentists can kind of prevent or decrease the chance of these things happening, but kind of even going back even further. So say I'm looking at a practice and I want to buy it. Okay. I don't have the luxury of maybe working in that practice before I buy it. Is there anything that I can look at, whether it be financials, interviewing the team members. What kind of things can a pre-owner do to kind of protect themselves and or at least uncover any embezzlement that's going on?
Uncovering embezzlement from that perspective is really challenging.
Yeah.
Here are a few things you can do. The first thing you need to do is to try to close the knowledge gap between you and the current owner of the practice. One of the dangers in buying a practice, and this is far broader than simply embezzlement, but they just know more about it than you do. So it's really your attorney's job when they're drafting the agreement for you to buy the practice to help you here. And the first thing I want the owner to say is that, to the best of my knowledge, there's no embezzlement going on.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, let's directly put them on record as saying that. This falls into a part of the purchase agreement called representations and warranties, and we want them to say, as far as I know, there's no embezzlement going on. We would also like them to say some other things that are slightly off the embezzlement topic, but equally important. One thing that I think any purchaser of a practice needs to do is get the seller to come clean on what they do with co-payments. So the insurance rules are you're required to collect, or at least make a proper effort to collect a co-payment.
Okay.
Let's say you buy a practice and you find out after the fact that the person selling it did not collect co-payments from patients. This paints you into a real corner because you're an ethical dentist and you know that that's something you have to do. So you start collecting co-payments and you have this patient revolt because they're not used to paying for dentistry. So that's a slightly different area where the knowledge gap can hurt you.
Okay.
But in terms of embezzlement, ideally you will interview the employees. Now, that can be a tricky area, and a lot of people selling a practice don't really want to tell the employees that they're selling it. So I'm not totally sure how they are going to have you interview a group of people without perhaps taking the practice owner a little further down that path than they want to. One way to do that, though, is to do a two-phase purchase where you start with a letter of intent and you nail down the major terms with the seller. And then once the major terms are nailed down and everybody's in agreement on the price and all those other things, hopefully the seller's confident with you spending a little bit of time with staff. On the other hand, I'm not sure that with the experience level and knowledge level that most practice purchasers have, that they're going to be able to interview a staff member for half an hour and say, yeah, she's stealing for sure.
Sure. Right. Now, would some of this kind of be uncovered a little bit better with the due diligence process with, so say I'm buying a practice and I have an accountant look over everything, and it's maybe even a dental specific accountant. Are they able to do those forensics on the financials to figure out, hey, there's something fishy going on here or something's not right?
It might happen, but it's unlikely. It's very rare that you can look at a set of financials from a practice and say, yeah, embezzlement must be happening there.
Right.
If it were that easy, I'd be out of a job because everybody could find their own embezzlement.
Sure.
We find it by digging fairly deeply into transactions in the practice. So we're looking at a very granular level at what's going on in the practice. And most accountants aren't going to do that for you. And even if they were inclined to, they don't have the skill set. So a lot of our time looking for embezzlement is spent with our head in the practice management software. And okay. That's, to most accountants, even dental specific accountants, kind of a foreign country. So the only possibility for them to detect embezzlement is by looking at practice ratios and comparing them with other practices that they know. And for example, if somebody was padding their payroll significantly, that will cause perhaps the payroll ratio. In other words, if you took the practice's payroll expense and divided it by revenue, that might cause that ratio to be a little bit out of whack.
Okay.
But when you look at 10 different practices, you may see a fairly wide variability in terms of that ratio anyway. And it just depends on what kind of practice it is. If you're looking at a practice that is a really high-end practice, does a lot of full mouth reconstructions and stuff like that, the ratio of revenue to staff, or staff to revenue, is probably lower
Right.
than sort of a very restorative, hygiene-oriented practice. So, sometimes looking at the same practice over time will tell you something. Sometimes comparing a practice to other ones will, but most embezzlement happens on the revenue side, and the impact just isn't enough to really throw the ratios out of whack. In other words, if I steal 4% of your revenue, what does that do to your staff to revenue ratio? Not much. You're now dividing your staff expense by 96% instead of 100%. It just doesn't make a big deal.
Yeah.
And that's the way that most stealing manifests. So that kind of process won't see it. You really would need something more intensive and also more expensive, and I think that tends to put it out of reach for a lot of practice owners. I mean, we do work for some bigger practice configurations who are sort of buying practices all the time, and we will perform certain tests on a practice they're looking to buy just as a kind of routine thing. But unfortunately, I think for most people in your shoes looking at buying a practice, to spend conceivably $7,000 or $8,000 on this process.
Right.
So are you seeing? Is there anything that pre-owners can do to just like anything like a checklist to like say, okay, I'm supposed to be seeing these things, or if would anything tell me I need to dig deeper in and maybe hire a company like yours just to actually sniff it out?
I'll make a generic statement about this. This kind of work is very technical. Um, the people we hire to work as investigators tend to have 10 to 15 years experience in some corner of dentistry before we hire them, and then it takes them about 2 years with us to sort of get fully up to speed. So a lot of the people we hire are sort of late career dentists who have repetitive motion problems or something like that. They've owned a practice for 20 years and now they're looking. Somebody with your level of experience is going to have a very difficult time replicating what that person would do.
Right.
But here's what I will say: don't buy a practice without doing a chart audit, first of all. And if you want, we can talk about some things to look at there.
Please.
And don't buy a practice without having free reign in the practice management software so that you can look in there and see what's there. What happens a lot of times too is that somebody will take the P&L that the accountants prepare, and they will do their calculations from that. That's what they'll take to the bank to get their financing. It's what their accountant will use when they're calculating whether or not they can service the debt that they're going to incur to buy the practice. That will be the raw material for all those things. The step that gets missed a lot, though, is to prepare a revenue report from the practice management software for the same period and sit the two of them down side by side and say, do they line up? And they won't exactly, because there's a little bit of timing difference between when your practice management software recognizes revenue and when that same revenue gets to your bank. So they may not correspond to the penny, but they should be pretty darn close.
So with the chart audit, can you kind of take us through what are some things we can look for?
Absolutely. A few things that I think you should look for, and some of these are embezzlement related. Some of them are just a function of trying to understand what you're buying. One thing that I encourage everybody to look at is what I call recall interval. And what I mean by that is how much time passes between recall appointments. And you learn a whole lot of things from that. For example, um, do they have enough or too many hygienists? How efficient is the front desk functioning? Because, if people are going, if people who should be seen every 6 months are going 8.5, it's one of two things. It's either a capacity problem in the office or it's an efficiency problem at the front desk.
Yeah.
So that one to me is a very key metric. And a lot of practices that underperform start because the hygiene throughput isn't what it should be. If you think about it, everybody who gets into your chair gets there through the hygiene operatory. So if people aren't being seen with the frequency they should in hygiene, sooner or later that's going to choke you. So
Yeah, I think you're bringing up pretty good points on the hygiene, because I know we at Shared Practices really try to kind of educate buyers on what does a hygiene percentage look like, what's the reappointment rate, how often are you getting those patients back, and just using that to, like you said, gauge capacity issues or other things that could be going on.
So, if you grab 100 charts from a practice and look at them, you'll get a very good barometer on the things you're talking about.
Right.
Another thing that I want to look at is, and again, we can only really see this in the practice management software, treatment that has been identified and not performed. And that has a couple implications. First of all, the more of that stuff there is, the better for you, because that means you're stepping into future work. On the other hand, you have to ask the question, well, if it's been identified, if this patient has known for a year and a half that they need this crown, why haven't they gotten it yet? And that may point to a lot of things, but typically it's a failure in the cycle of events that have to happen for somebody to get a crown. And it might be a factor that you won't inherit. For example, it might be that the doctor you're buying from isn't terribly good at communicating with patients about their treatment needs, but it might also be that a predetermination's been sent to an insurance company and has come back and nobody's acted on it. So
More of an operational inefficiency that things are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another really good thing to look at is outstanding insurance claims. So most practice management software, in fact, all practice management software, will track when an insurance claim has been sent out and it hasn't been paid. So let's have a look at those. And a couple of things there. It's possible that, in fact, the claim was paid and a staff member stolen the money and never entered a payment into the practice management software. That's one possible cause. And another is that claims are being sent minus information that's needed, or they're not being followed up, or when an insurance company writes back to the practice and says we'd like to see x-rays, that never happens. So again, you can learn a lot from looking at those.
Right.
Would you say most of the time that you see it's more than likely operational inefficiencies than actual insidious like embezzlement?
I tend to see the embezzlement end of that spectrum simply because of what I do.
Right.
But let's face it, there is also a lot of operational inefficiency out there, and really what I'm talking about is getting to learn about the practice you want to buy from the inside out.
Right.
The way that a lot of buyers gather their information is they ask the person selling the practice questions. And that's fine to a point, but it shouldn't be your only source of information. And, sometimes there are things they don't know about the practice that they probably should. And other times there are things that they know about the practice and they just don't want to tell you.
Yeah.
So we need to gather information from primary sources. And there's a whole world of knowledge inside the practice management software.
Right. So I kind of want to circle back a little bit to, when you're actually purchasing the practice and, trying to figure out whether or not embezzlement's going on. You mentioned that in some circumstances you might have the opportunity to interview the staff, and this may even be after you purchase the practice. Let's just say that it is. When you were defining what embezzlement is, you said that it's someone in a position of trust that's stealing from the person that's entrusted them. So is that to say that people that are more highly trusted within the practice should be more suspected
Um,
in terms of their duties, I suppose?
wow. There is a correlation between trust and ability to steal. In other words, if there's somebody in the practice you don't trust, first of all, you're probably going to just fire them and move on.
Right.
If you, for whatever reason, don't do that, your second position is, well, I'm not going to put them anywhere that where they could steal. So I'll make them the float sterilization assistant,
Yes.
which, other than stealing the odd instrument, doesn't give them a whole lot of ability to do much.
Sure.
Put another way, everybody who you hire in your practice has already passed through your internal trust filter when you were interviewing them, or you wouldn't have hired them.
Right.
It's a little bit different when you inherit 12 staff because you bought a practice, but certainly going forward, everybody you hire will start from a position of your trust.
Okay.
I think part of your question was, do certain people in a practice have more opportunity to steal than others? And
Definitely.
the answer is for sure. People in the clinical area typically don't have access to incoming funds. In other words, it's not like the patient gets up out of your chair and hands your assistant the money for the treatment that just happened, right? That all happens at the front desk.
Yes.
So if your assistant is going to steal, it probably isn't patient payments or insurance payments. It's probably rotary endo files that are being put in her pocket and sold on eBay.
Yeah. I see.
Okay. So in terms of, I mean, we're kind of talking about people that would be more likely to do it. I'm assuming that's people in the front, people that are handling things on the revenue side. In terms of the segregation of duties, what are some things that you can do to try and prevent people from having those opportunities?
The problem here is that the theory is very clear. Breaking up duties between multiple people in general reduces the chances of theft.
Yeah.
The practicality is, in a small dental practice, I mean, if you buy a small practice, your administrative staff is probably one person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how do you divide up their duties?
Right.
On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday you do this, and on Thursday and Friday you do different things. I mean, that's not really what's contemplated. So you run into some practical limitations. The other thing about dividing up duties is that there's an assumption there that we should probably make explicit. And the assumption is that if I'm working for you, Tyler, and I want to steal from you,
mm-hmm.
that I'm probably going to be pretty reluctant to go to my coworker and say, I want to steal from our boss, but I really need your help. Okay, that's the cornerstone on which division of duties is built.
Right.
One problem that people run into is, in a lot of practices, you have two sisters working at the front desk, or mother and son or something, and dividing up duties between those people is futile.
Yeah.
Because that kind of conversation, the one that starts with, I want to steal from Tyler and I need your help, is one that really could happen there.
That makes sense.
So
I'm guessing you've had some experience with those situations. Every experience you're saying, it's like, okay, I guarantee you've seen quite a bit and quite wild stories with these.
Yeah, I've been at this 30 years. Although, Clay, every time I think I've seen it all, something happens that reminds me that I haven't actually seen it all.
So what's your latest story? We'll go back to this. I want to hear the crazy story here.
Latest crazy story? Well, we just wrapped up about 3 weeks ago an investigation of an embezzlement. It was a big one. It was around $400,000. And wow. The best part of this, though, was that we had this woman arrested at her attorney's office.
Wow.
It was one of the best takedowns I've ever seen. Put the cuffs on her right in front of her lawyer.
Oh my.
Wow.
And, one of my favorite sounds is that clicking noise that handcuffs make.
Oh boy.
Now, but David, let me kind of clear up something. I mean, is it you guys found the embezzlement and then you guys just went straight to the cops and then they drove you to the attorney's office and then they was it all within a day that you guys did all this or how long?
Um,
So I discover embezzlement in my office. How long can I expect the slow wheels of the justice system to move?
they're slow usually. In um, in this case, and our typical investigation takes about 8 weeks,
Okay.
which is another impediment to doing it as part of a purchase.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times the lead time in a purchase, especially if you're getting a really good deal, is shorter. The dentist who finds out he has a month to live and needs to sell his practice, you can't say to him, but we're going to need 2 months to kick the tires first. Um, so from the point where our investigation's finished and we've handed the doctor their report, it varies widely. It depends on how much money is taken. It depends on, frankly, where you are in the country. Um, it's relatively rare that the police will come into a practice and kind of put the cuffs on somebody and lead them out the door.
Even though we might all want that.
Oh, we
They
all
don't take,
want that.
they don't take requests.
We all want that. The problem is that embezzlement's a little bit different than a lot of other crimes. I mean, if somebody steals your car and you're out somewhere tonight and you park the car and you come back 2 hours later and the car's gone, it's really simple for you to tell the police, here's what I lost. It's a
Yeah.
2017 Toyota RAV4 hybrid, gray in color, and here's the serial number, and this is the license plate. I mean, you can tell the police all that, or when you sober up, you could, and they know what they're looking for. And if they find your car driving around the other side of town, they're just going to put the cuffs on whoever's driving it.
Right.
This is a little bit different. It's a very technical crime, and it's well beyond the ability of any police department to investigate. So that creates a situation that's a little different than what they're used to working with, where somebody else like us act as primary investigators, and the police are really secondary investigators, and they start their work once we finish ours. So typically they need some time to do that. I mean, they will want to interview the suspect. They may want to get what's called a subpoena and look at the suspect's bank records. If money's been spent on something, they may want to try to follow the chain of dollars. So if somebody stole money from you and bought a boat with it, they want to go to the boat dealer and say, well, how did this person pay for it? Oh, really? They bought a $40,000 boat in cash, and you didn't think that was a little unusual?
Right.
They need to do all that stuff, and it just depends on workload. The other issue that we face over and over again with police departments is they all have a finite budget, and they have to allocate that budget between violent crime and nonviolent or white collar crime. Which one do you think most police departments, and for that matter, most taxpayers, think is the priority?
Probably the violent crimes.
Yeah, the person who they find in the street with a knife sticking in them is going to probably jump over an embezzled dentist on their priority list.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in cases where embezzlement is discovered and the reins of justice come in, are there ways that dentists can recoup their losses? Are there like fidelity bonds? Are there kinds of insurance that people can invest in to protect themselves?
Yeah, there are. Almost every practice has some amount of insurance for this.
Okay.
So built into your property insurance, the stuff that covers fires and floods and things like that, is some amount for employee dishonesty. Okay. And the default amount that is in most of those policies is $25,000. So probably when you buy your practice and you go to your insurance agent at State Farm and you say, all right, I need to insure my stuff, they will typically just toss $25,000 of employee dishonesty into your coverage without even having a conversation with you about it.
Okay.
Now, I talked a few minutes ago about the magnitude of theft, and in the average theft, that would get you back something less than a quarter of your losses.
Right. Yeah.
So, a worthwhile thing to think about is to increase that coverage to a bigger number, like $75,000 or $100,000, which the cost of, by the way, is pretty small. I mean, for about $20 a month, you can buy yourself a lot more insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I think about. Once you've been stolen from, that insurance is kind of the easy money to get. If you have lost more than what your insurance covers, now it becomes a little more difficult. And there are really two ways that you can get money back after that. The first way is to sue the thief, which tends not to be very productive. I mean, the people who are stealing your money are also good at spending it. Right. And they will spend it on stuff that doesn't give them enduring value. I mean, they'll buy expensive clothes, they'll take trips, they'll get cosmetic surgery. Understand that a lot of people are stealing because of that ego deficit that I talked about before. So they will do things that make them look successful, or they'll fix that piece of their anatomy that they've never liked or whatever.
Right. Those sound like some behavioral red flags that we can be looking out for as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So getting money back, especially by suing them, is pretty unproductive. And when you sue somebody, you have to pay your own attorney. When somebody commits a criminal act like embezzlement, holding them to justice for that is not something the doctor has to pay for. In other words, you do not need your own attorney to prosecute somebody for embezzling. The state you live in will take care of that. The third place you can get money back is if a thief has been cashing your checks, you have some recourse against the bank that let them do that.
Oh, interesting.
But that's not the case in every theft. So, that it depends on how they steal. The other way that people get recovery is typically when somebody is charged criminally as part of their sentence. So they may get a prison sentence, or they may get what's called a suspended sentence, which means they don't go to jail, but they get a criminal record.
Sure.
Often as part of their sentence, they'll get what's called a restitution order. So the judge will say, in addition to everything else, I order you to pay back the person you stole the money from $225,000. So the person, of course, will immediately say, well, Judge, I don't have $225,000, and I've lost my job and I'm about to be locked up, so I can't really earn any money. And the judge will say, I know. And when you get out, you will start paying at a rate of $600 a month. So they're paying back something, but in a lot of cases, they'd have to roughly double their life expectancy to actually fully pay you back.
Yeah.
So, David, it kind of seems like it's hard to detect embezzlement. It's hard to recoup your money after it happens. So, I mean, how do we prevent these things from happening? Like, to me, I guess it would be on the prevention side of things is how we decrease embezzlement.
It's no different than dentistry. It's a lot cheaper to brush your teeth and floss than deal with what happens when you don't.
You heard it here first.
It warms our heart to hear you say that. It really does.
So the first thing is dentists do a terrible job when they hire staff of properly checking them out. And dentistry has allowed itself to get out of step with the way that most of America hires. Mm-hmm. I could not get a job at FedEx delivering the crap people buy on Amazon without going through a drug test. And yet probably 2% of dental practices in the US do drug tests before they hire people. And the biggest difference between FedEx and your dental practice is they don't have prescription pads sitting in every van.
Very true. Yeah.
Okay. That makes no sense. It drives me absolutely crazy that dentistry has gotten into this mindset of we just trust people.
To our detriment.
Yeah, tremendously. I'll give you a sobering statistic. 65 million Americans, so that's approximately 1 in 4 adults, has a criminal record. And yet,
Wow.
most dentists, when they're checking people's backgrounds, do not do a criminal records check.
Yeah.
Now, I should say not every criminal record should stop somebody from being hired.
Right.
You know, somebody who had a marijuana possession 20 years ago in college, um, you know, that person wouldn't have any problem getting hired. Whereas
Right.
for me, you know, assuming everything else was right. The important thing though is I need to get the information and I need to make hiring decisions from a position of knowledge, not simply I like this person, you'll do, you're hired.
Yeah. In your experience, do embezzlers typically have pre-existing criminal backgrounds?
Not all of them do. I mean, every embezzler has a first time.
Of course. Yeah.
So not all of them do, but some do, and let's screen them out.
I understand.
The other thing that dentists do a miserable job of is picking up the phone, calling previous employers,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, you know, what was this person like as an employee? Would you rehire them? Just a little pointer on that. When you are making that call, and my rule is really simple. I want to call everybody that these people have worked for at least the past 5 years.
Yeah.
But here's the tip. Don't call any phone number that an applicant gives you.
They could just give you to their Uncle
Yep.
Joe or
Uncle Joe.
Aunt Sally, yeah, whoever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Google is incredibly cheap to use. When you're checking people out, let your fingers do the typing. If they say they worked for Dr. Martin Smith in Peoria, Illinois, go find Dr. Martin Smith in Google and call that number, and then you know you're really talking to Dr. Smith.
Sure. Yeah.
So we've got to get better at checking out people before we hire them, and your clearest method of protecting yourself is right there. And a lot of times when we see embezzlement, we can trace it back to a bad hiring decision. You know, there was information that was available at the time of hiring that just wasn't accessed.
Mm.
The second thing is, to a lot of dentists, their practice management software may as well be written in some foreign language.
Yeah, so many reports don't know where to look for what and why is this coming up here.
Yeah, or Clay, your way of getting information is to ask a staff member to give it to you.
Oh, like print off these reports, you know.
Yeah, and
I want to check them at the end of the day.
Print off your reports. You've lost control over the parameters. And if I'm a little bit knowledgeable about your software, I can make the report say whatever I want.
Yeah.
So that piece of software is at least as important to your financial well-being as your handpiece is.
Yeah.
And your profession all know that handpiece like it's their child. But
exactly.
When it comes to the practice management software, it's like, you know? So
I think something for pre-owners too is, I think, kind of glean from this is like understanding, decreasing that knowledge gap with that practice management software. Understand what reports, what they're doing, what the numbers mean on certain reports and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about, David?
It absolutely is. There is a wealth of information in there, and it not just about embezzlement, but also about setting the strategic direction of your practice. I mean, there's so much you can learn from your software. You know, should I go in network or out of network with a particular PPO? Should I offer some kind of discount or incentive program? You know, should I work with an outsourced patient financing company like Care Credit? You know, there are lots of strategic decisions that are really governed by the knowledge that's in that software. And, you know, for a lot of you, you just don't have the access to that information that you should. So Second thing is come up, shake hands, introduce yourself to your practice management software, and um, get to know it. I understand that a lot of older dentists who, where sort of the software came in mid-career for them when they were used to dealing with the old manual system. I understand the struggle for them in trying to climb the mountain of understanding the software. But for young practice owners and aspirant practice owners who I'm going to think are much more comfortable with technology than the older generation, this just shouldn't be that hard.
Yeah.
The next thing I'm going to say, and it goes back to something that I think Clay said a few minutes ago, a lot of the telltales when somebody's stealing are behavioral. When people steal from your practice, they behave in certain ways. And one thing that every young practice owner needs to do is understand what embezzling behavior looks like and then watch for
it. And what are some of those behaviors, if you could just sum up briefly a few of them?
There are a lot of things, but I'll give you a list. One of the most predominant characteristics of thieves is territoriality. And what I mean by that is possessiveness about their duties, a reluctance to delegate or cross-train anybody else to do part of their job. It will often even extend to their workspace and their computer. So somebody who gets mad when another employee sits at their desk or touches their computer or something, that's what I'm talking about with territoriality. The other one that's really easy to observe is that a lot of thieves will want to do at least some of their stealing work when nobody else is around. So they will try to construct a situation where they'll be in the practice by themselves at some time during the week. And they may get there an hour before everybody else, or they may stay late, or they may come back in on Saturday to quote catch up on some paperwork. But they will want to be alone. This one is a little bit less universal, but a lot of thieves are reluctant to take vacation because when they're gone, they lose control over what information gets to you and what doesn't. They will often they will do what are called conspicuous displays of honesty. In other words, honest people don't need to keep telling you or showing you how honest they are. And when somebody does that, it's really a symptom of dishonesty. So we want to watch for the people who sort of push it in front of you.
Yeah. So, David, if someone were interested in enlisting the services of someone like yourself with Prosperity, how would they reach out to you, and what does that sort of relationship look like?
In terms of how to get us, it's easy. You can go to our website, which once you hear it, you'll remember. It's www.dentalembezzlement.com. And
Okay.
The only trick in all that is spelling embezzlement correctly. And if you don't know how, Google will help you. Or you can call us at our toll-free number, which is 888-398-2327. So either of those ways you can reach out to us. We do different things for people with different needs. For example, when somebody's got embezzlement concerns or there are a lot of risk factors there, we'll do what we think of as an investigation. The other word people might use for it is an audit, where we will stealthily, in other words, without the staff being able to realize that we're doing it, we will take a good in-depth look at practice management software.
Okay.
Another thing that we do is we help doctors set up their practice systems, and I'm not just talking about computer systems, but in general how the practice functions in a way that's as protective to them as it can be. So we will make sure that they're looking at the right things when they hire people, and
Sure.
we'll help them understand which reports they need to look at and what they're looking at in those reports and things like that. So for a new practice owner, and that's a time of particular vulnerability because the staff who have been there for 10 years know that you're green as grass and don't necessarily feel the same affection for you that they felt for your predecessor.
Right.
Getting and when you think about systems in most practices, I always describe it like the amalgam that's been patched 3 times. Somebody buys a practice and they take over a bunch of systems from the former owner, and then they over a period of 5 or 10 years, they go through 3 or 4 office managers, and each of them has a hand in shaping the systems a little bit, and then you buy the practice. And that's not a well rationalized set of systems. It's a whole bunch of things that are done for some reason which might not even matter today, to somebody else's preference. So we do a lot of work with practice owners in terms of making sure that their office functioning is done in a well thought out way.
Perfect. Well, Tyler, do you have any other questions for David?
I think that just about exhausts everything that I had to ask. I mean, David, I really appreciate you being on, and I think us and our audience as well has gotten a lot of value from it. And I think that I wasn't entirely sure, to what degree your knowledge would benefit someone in the pre-ownership stage, but I think that we've gotten a pretty good idea of some things we can look out for and what to expect once we get into a practice. So
Perfect.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, David. And I think kind of the biggest takeaway I got was you have to know what you're getting into. And I think understanding that practice management software is going to be a big, it's a big hurdle, but I think it's worth getting over so that you can kind of go into the practice eyes wide open and understand what's going on.
One of the biggest dangers is people tend to commoditize revenue.
Yeah.
In other words, you're looking at practice A versus practice B, and you compare the dollar revenue of one versus the dollar revenue of the other, and you try to relate that to the asking prices of both.
Right.
And as a purchaser, that's really dangerous. You need to understand what's behind that revenue. For example, if you're buying from some guy who's got a bit of a personality cult, and the way that personality cult manifests in dentistry is I can charge a higher fee than my competitors do.
Right.
Okay. If you buy that practice, unless you have that same personality cult, which is pretty rare in dentistry, then what's going to happen is if you do the same volume of dentistry that the former owner did, you're going to be doing it at maybe 60% of their fees. So you really need to understand the revenue and how much of it is hygiene and how much of it is insurance and how much of it is pediatric dentistry and how much of it is gerodontics, and get deeply into that and not simply fall into the trap of seeing a dollar sign and some stuff after it, because that can be really misleading.
Yeah, to be honest, that's something that we try to preach a lot on the show, and I wasn't totally expecting to get into that as much as we have today when talking about embezzlement, but I'm really glad that you did.
Yeah, it just keeps coming up. I mean, I think it just shows how important that is. So
yeah, certainly.
Well, David, we appreciate your time, and certainly if any of our listeners have any questions, they can reach out to us. They can email us, and then we can forward those on to David, or you can reach out to David directly. Hope you guys enjoyed this week, and we'll be back next week. Take care.